Hey YouTube, this video I wanted to sort of ramble a little bit about um, the Jesuit philosopher and scientist Teilhard de Chardin and his thoughts on the noosphere, um, some of his writings about the future that we happen to be living in, and the future that I hope that we can realize somehow. Teilhard de Chardin, he was a Jesuit, and he wrote prolifically, although none of his work was published, um, about the evolution of consciousness, about the relationship that human beings have with technology and communication, um, and specifically because he was interested in evolution biologically, the relationship between, our consciousness and its development, where it was going. He believed that the human being on this planet introduced a new dimension of experience that life could now have through thought and reflection and self-reflection and meaning. And you could say that he was a little anthropocentric about it because, meaning that, human-centric in a certain sense, but he did believe that with human beings, the world had a certain fundamental shift, a kind of heating up of consciousness and the evolution of consciousness in the hominids and in mammals, and just his books have this entire spectrum of the evolution of the nervous system. As the nervous system develops over time and gets more complex, and the brain gets more complex and diversifies, and he would often say in his own kind of unique, eccentric, metaphoric language, consciousness would fold upon itself, and a new intensity of consciousness would emerge because of the complexity of the organism. And he believed that in human societies, we were, in a sense, a kind of, I guess you could say, a cooking pot of consciousness as it cooked itself to higher and higher degrees and intensities. And he believed that the age that he was living in, which was the turn of the last century into mid-20th century, consciousness was heating up to a point where all of the world's cultures were converging upon each other, and it was manifesting itself, primarily in negative ways, in ways that were destructive through world wars, but also through positive ways, through greater forms of economic trade, greater forms of social complexity, where all these different societies and cultures were now mingling with each other, and new infrastructures were allowing us to mingle with each other, and yes, combat, but also trade, and trade ideas, and trade concepts, and trade cultures. So he believed that we were living in an age of a tremendous increase of social complexity, a tremendous increase in technological complexity, and thus a tremendous transformation or metamorphosis of human consciousness. So, with World War II happening, with World War I happening, he felt that we were reaching what he called a boiling point, a point where we would not be able to go back from where we once were. Just as, the emergence of the human being who is able to think about ourselves, to think about thinking, self-reflection. That important leap in consciousness, in the development of the human organism as we know ourselves to be, we would be experiencing something to that degree in this century, in the coming centuries, in the near future, where consciousness would again intensify through our interactivities. So that was sort of his broad painting of the evolution of consciousness and where we are today. And I bring it all up because I loved his idea of what he said about intensity and intensification, which coincides with complexity, because I think intensity is a very good and very apt metaphor for what's happening in the world today. If you look at the news, all biases aside with the mainstream media, there's so much conflict. There's so much heating up of things that are going on everywhere, all over the world, and the internet, um, as a kind of extension of this new mutation in consciousness, this next phase or um, boiling point of consciousness. And the internet, in a certain sense, really heats up the atmosphere. It really um, brings people together whether they like it or not, and envelops the world in this communication network, where we're really butting heads, and we're forced to communicate with each other in ways that erode the privacy of, you know, what we classically thought of ourselves as individuals, with our private property, and there's a difference between the private and the public, and now with the internet, that's sort of blurring. Um, and more so with cultures, they're clashing with each other. I mean, look at the recent video with the protests in the Arab world against that ridiculous anti-Islam, anti-Muslim video. Um, Nobody would have paid attention to it, but for some reason it took off virally. And it's a piece of crap. It's a piece of trash. I mean, if you look at it, it's not really conflict of civilizations. It was a joke, but it created a conflict because of YouTube, because that video was available for them to see and get outraged by. And when there's protests going on, we put those online, sometimes in ways that mainstream media cannot do. So I think there's something to the modern communication technology really heating up and intensifying um, our consciousness, our interactivity with each other, our social consciousness, and our exposure to each other. I'll give you another example. Last year, I was living in Southwest Arcadia in Florida, and really the only way that place came to exist, where I can move and teach kids about progressive education and alternative um, philosophy and what would you call it? Ecological awareness. These are all things that aren't necessarily in the middle of nowhere in the United States. They are usually progressive hubs. Well, with the internet, you can kind of take your hub with you. With the internet, location, as far as physicality is concerned, matters to a lesser degree. I think it still matters, but it matters to a lesser degree now. You can be in the middle of nowhere and still be very involved with people, in the midst of communication, and have access to knowledge, to have access to people, emails, commerce, networking, coordinating with people from afar, and be in a remote place. So location becomes less of an importance, but then locations themselves might be changed because of that. Because, the borders that once created a remote area are no longer, an objection or hindrance to going in that area and bringing a new culture. Or for individuals in that, let's say, remote southern rural area, from hopping online and getting exposed to interesting ideas. So, I mean, while it certainly doesn't change everything, I think the internet has some kind of, and digital media in general, has some kind of shrinking effect, where we are kind of exposed to the global village in a way that television was not able to do. Um, and kind of brings everybody a little bit closer to everybody else, and we're responding to that in many different ways. I think if you look at, the resurgence of tribalism and nationalism in the past, 50 years, that sort of attitude is a kind of contraction away from, this shrinking of the planet, where we're all kind of converging upon each other. And, reacting in that way, where you kind of, put your defenses up and you reify who you are in response to a world that you're getting exposed to, it makes sense. Of course, that sort of thinking is also not a sustainable attitude to have in the long run, because in the long run, we're going to have to learn how to get along. But in the meanwhile, I think the internet as a new form of intensity, as a boiling point for our global planetary era, is definitely a marker that should be studied and noticed more. And, you know, to give like one more example, I'm part of the Evolver social network now, and this network is starting, all over the globe. It's starting a locally. We have network meetings, and we have that sort of those online conferences and things where we organize. But then it's so decentralized, and it allows that kind of decentralized and self-emergent rhizomatic structure to proliferate and propagate. And a spore, that's what they call them, in, let's say, Australia or New Zealand, and I coordinate with folks from New Zealand. Um, a spore in New Zealand has the same information, the same techniques and knowledge and Wikipedia database and how to get started and resources as the New York spore, and potentially can become a major hub. So, I mean, this kind of ability, I think, is profoundly underestimated, and I believe that in the coming decades, there's going to be, in a certain sense, um, to bring it back to like rural Florida, a recolonization by our own technologies of, this new consciousness, this new global consciousness. And in a way, it's unavoidable because it kind of envelops and surrounds the older cultures, which once relied upon physical boundaries to separate them from other people, or to be isolated. And there are pros and cons to this. I just think it's kind of ironic that, especially in the United States, where we are a colony. We started as a colony. We pushed other indigenous cultures and tribes out through, modernization, industrialization, through, Western imperialism or whatever you want to call it. And now, interestingly enough, we're kind of recolonizing ourselves in a way. And I was surprised to find that Marshall McLuhan, the media theorist, had a very similar idea where he basically stated, and I don't know if people have really picked up on this idea or not, but he stated in Understanding Media and other texts that, as the West colonizes other cultures, as the West explodes with industrialization and modernization, um, the West equally implodes upon itself and in a sense, traumatically colonizes itself with new electronic culture. And that was sort of his terminology for this, electronic culture, um, cultures that use electricity, and the effect on our consciousness that electric technologies have. And that could be a whole separate other video, and that's sort of what I have been exploring in sections of my my thesis writing. And this is sort of a way to vent to you guys about my thesis, and if you're interested, you can comment. But yeah, that's about it for this video. We covered Teilhard, we covered some of his ideas about intensification and consciousness, and how the internet in a real way is sort of doing this. It's kind of this eruption of this new intensified global consciousness, which we are reacting to both negatively and positively, and we really have to learn how to accommodate in this world. The forces of technological evolution have kind of unleashed previously forgotten and unknown powers, and new relations to our experience of time and space and other cultures, and thus a new relationship in how we order and identify as who we are. Are we just national identities anymore, or are we kind of being forced to and enveloped in this new technological social system, which rightly some people are paranoid about, but otherwise I think we have to find ways to do this more consciously and integrate more consciously in this age, if we're going to get along and make this world a better place and help use this technology to make this world a better place. So anyway, those are my thoughts, and thanks for listening.